Hello class, this is Mr. Longden. I am going to show you today, this is our video about the descriptive statistics spreadsheet tutorial. So on my screen right now, you'll notice that I have Microsoft Excel open. I'll be doing that with you today. If you're using another spreadsheet software like Google Sheets, for example, you're more than welcome to do so, but just keep in mind that the formatting and the tools and the different formulas that I'm using today may be named differently in those programs, so you'll have to do some research and figure out what those look like. So here is what I have so far. You'll notice that I have some information. I have a column of looks like years in column A over here. I have a column B, looks like just random sporadic numbers in the thousands. And I have a descriptive statistics section that has all of the descriptive statistics that I'm expecting you to calculate outlined here. So we have mean, median, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, Q1, Q3, and then the interquartile range. So we're going to calculate all those today, and then the values will go in column E. So I would expect that you would have all of these lined up in that fashion. All right, so we're going to do four things in this video. We're going to calculate all of the descriptive statistics into column E. And then what we'll do is we'll format this data so that way it looks a lot nicer, because right now it doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of like what those numbers in column A and column B mean, and we'll make it look a little more user-friendly. Then what we'll do is we will build the scatter plot from the data that we have. And then after that, we'll format that scatter plot and put that on a new tab so that way it's easier to look at and read. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's just start with the descriptive statistics calculation. So we're going to be using formulas for each of these. If you recall, a formula has to start with an equal sign, so we'll start with that. But if you're more comfortable doing it this way, you can type in the formulas into these cells here in column E. Otherwise, you can go into the Formulas tab up on the top here. And what we're looking for is under More Functions, probably. It's called Statistical. So we'll be looking at a lot of these things. So for example, if we start in with the mean, so if you recall, the mean is just the average of the data set. So it's all these numbers in column B added up and divided by the number of items. So what we'll do is we'll find more functions, and we can go Statistical. It's just the average. So the average, and then it will ask us, okay, well, which numbers do we want to choose? So we'll give it a range, and it says B2 through D2, and that is not what we want, because that's going to be this row right here. We actually want it to be all of these elements from B2 to B11. So if you use number 1, you'll highlight all of those, and that's actually all we need. That's the only mandatory entry we need to have, is just adding all those up. And then you'll see right here is the calculation preview right here. So it's 4,150.7. So we'll click OK. That'll look fine. We'll leave that good for now. That's the average. The median is actually the median. So we'll go back to statistical. We can scroll down until it's in alphabetical order. Find median. That's perfect. And we'll do the exact same thing. We're going to use the exact same numbers from B2 to B11. So you just click and highlight those. And this is B2 through B11, and then that number is 4,321.5. So you'll notice that that median is not in my data set anywhere, and the reason is because I have an even number of items. So what it does is it takes the two middle ones, if it sorts them based on what number they are from highest to lowest, adds those two middle ones together and then divides it by 2. So that's the one that I get. Okay, so that's what we get for the median. Now, standard deviation is a little bit trickier. So if we look at that, let's go and look into our statistical functions. So if we go down to standard deviation, it's actually STD. Notice we have a couple of options here. We've got a whole bunch of these: STD, EV.P, .S, A, and then PA. So if we look at these, it says that we've got calculates the standard deviation based on the entire population. And we've also got the sample for these two. These other ones are a little different. They actually allow you to include like text and things. We're not interested in that so much, so we're going to ignore these bottom two. So really, it's just a matter of which one do we want to choose, the population or the sample. I'd recommend the sample just because that's typically what we're doing, is getting a sample of a greater size. Typically, whatever topic you chose will be a sample, so we'll pick that one. We're going to do this stdev.s. We'll do that. Now, this will ask for the exact same set of numbers again, so it's just B2 through B11. You're noticing a trend here. Some of these will change, but basically this one will stay consistent, and that will be our standard deviation is 691 point and all that. So we'll click OK. That looks good. Now the minimum, we can do this a couple different ways. The easiest way is just to use the min function. So if we go to statistical again, let's see if we have the minimum in here, and we do. It's right there, it's min. We're not doing the A because that's the same thing. It has the text option. We're not worried about that. We're just doing numbers. So min, we can choose the numbers again. Exact same number set one more time. B2 through B11. Click OK. All right. And then max is very similar. Go back to the statistical functions. Scroll down until you find max. And then do the exact same data set, B2 through B11, just like that. Now keep in mind too, while I'm doing this, your data set will probably be somewhere between 10 and 20. Mine is on the lower end, so I only have 10. So you'll want to include all the numbers, especially if you go up to 20. So just make sure you get the entire data set. Okay, all right, so we got our minimum at 2,874. That looks right. And then 4,923 for our max. That looks right as well. Now, the quartiles, let's take a look at those. These are a little bit different than the other functions, so we're going to have to put in a couple more numbers into this to make it work. So let's scroll down until we find the Qs. All right, so now we've got two different quartiles. We have quartile.exc, which means exclusive, and then we have inc, which is inclusive. So the difference between those two is that the exclusive does not include the median in the calculation, and the inclusive does. Typically, you do include the median when you're calculating the quartiles, so we're going to use that quartile.inc for this particular case. Go ahead and click on that. Now, you'll notice that this actually asks you for two different numbers. So the first thing is the array. The array is a fancy word for what numbers are you using to calculate the quartile, which is just the B2 through B11 again. Okay. Now, the quartile, on the other hand, you'll notice it says the quart is a number. It's a minimum value of 0 all the way up to 4. If you recall, we talked about this with the 5-number summary. There are 5 numbers. We have the minimum, quartile 1, the median, quartile 3, and the maximum. So those are the 5 numbers. In Excel, they use the numbers 0 through 4 to represent which quartile. So actually what we could have done in the minimum is we could have calculated that using this quartile function, but put in the number 0 because that's the very first number in the 5-number summary. It would have been the 0th quartile or the very lowest number. In our case, since this is quartile 1, we're going to use the first quartile right here, which is number 1. So go ahead and click on that and then type in 1. So that will find us the first quartile, which is at 3,751.75. Notice again, that's not in our data set because we have an even number. So that's going to be calculating it using the average, adding the two middle ones together and then dividing by 2. Okay, that looks good. We're going to do a very similar function for the third quartile. We'll scroll down to the quartile again. Remember, we're using that inclusion. Right there, INC. And this time we're going to highlight the same numbers again, B2 through B11. And then the quartile this time will be 3, since that's our third quartile. We'll click OK. Awesome. And then finally, the interquartile range. We're actually not going to use a special statistical function for this one. If you recall, we already know that the interquartile range is simply the third quartile minus the first quartile. So all we have to do is push equals. We can actually click right on Q3, that number. So click on that cell, which is E8 in my case. Subtract, minus sign, and then we can do Q1. So E8 minus E7, that's our interquartile range, which happens to be 938.75. All right, so just to double check to make sure we got everything right, if you may not know this, but I'll show it to you right now. If you push the Control key and that little tilde key, it's that little squiggly line on the top left-hand corner of your keyboard, what that does is, notice that my screen changed slightly. I did that. Notice that now instead of the values, it actually shows the functions. This is what it's called function view in Excel. So you'll notice that all of my functions are here. So if we just want to check to make sure they're correct, we have the average, median, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, quartile for both 1 and 3, and then finally the interquartile range. All right, so you can go ahead and do that. Control tilde again to move it back to where it was. Okay, so I haven't given you any context yet on what my data is. So you're probably wondering, well, what in the world do all these numbers mean? Well, that's why we need to make some good labels to show what these are. So as you can see here, this should be fairly straightforward. These are just simply years, 2008 to 2009, 2009 to 2010, etc. So I'm going to label this just years. Now, my project that I did was I had gathered some data on the local hockey team that plays here, and I calculated all of the average attendance that hockey team has had every single year from its inception up until this year currently. So this is actually the average attendance per game. Okay, so I'll push enter. So now that gives me a much more descriptive title for what that data represents. Okay, so what you're going to notice now is that my data, my titles right here don't fit very well inside of those cells. So if you recall, the way that you do this is if you want to resize these, you just have to just double click between the two columns to resize them. Notice that my B1 went much bigger because there's a lot more information in that first cell. Descriptive statistics the same way, it went smaller because it was too wide, and then finally values, which will be just fine there. Okay, so now what we can do is we can do a couple of formatting things. This is our second part we're doing. I'm going to center these. So I go to my home tab, I can center these. And let's give it a nice, give it a style. So you can give it these styles right here. If I click on this drop-down menu next to styles, I like this first heading. That looks really nice. That's going to give us a nice feel for what we should be looking for. Notice it resized them again, made it a little bit bigger on all of them. I'm just going to resize these one more time, make them look better. Looks good. Okay. And then we can also do a couple of things with the formatting with the numbers. So notice that like this, for example, this standard deviation number has a huge long decimal point after it. So it's a very long number right now. That doesn't really match the other ones very well. Notice that some of these are like 0.5, 0.75, 0.75, things like that. So for the most part, you know, we're not so much interested in, you know, the percentages because you can't really have 0.7 attendance, 0.5 attendance. It's like half a person. Doesn't make any sense. So in our case, we're going to want to make this into a whole number. There's a couple different ways to do that, but my recommendation is we can use this comma style. Let's start with that. And notice that it gives us 2 decimal points, and even so, we're not really that interested in it. So what I can do now is I can click on this decrease decimal button and make it smaller. So now that gives me whole numbers. That makes a lot more sense in the context of what I'm doing. Since I'm working with people, whole people, we want to have whole numbers. And I'll do the exact same thing over here for column B. I will highlight all the numbers, I will do a comma style, and I'll just get rid of those decimal points. So that way these numbers make more sense in the context of my particular research project. Okay, I'm actually going to do a couple different things. I'm going to highlight my descriptive statistics headings. I'm going to bold those, so you can click on the B button up here in the toolbar, or you can just do Control B on your keyboard, B as in boy. And I can do the same thing for the years. I can make those bold as well. All right, so that looks much more user-friendly. I think we can read that a little bit better, and this will make it much easier for our whoever is looking at this data to understand it and figure out what each of these values means. So that's going to be our second part. Okay, we got 2 more parts to go. Not too much longer. So what we're going to do next is we are going to create a scatter plot. So we're mostly interested in these 2 columns right here, B, A, and B. So if you recall, a scatter plot needs to have 2 variables. It needs to have an independent variable and a dependent variable. So in our case, our independent variable is the years. Those will change. They change regardless of what the attendance is. So that will be the first column, and then the second column is the dependent variable. Depending on which year it is, that will tell us what our average attendance per game happened to be. Okay, so we're going to highlight both of those, just the data. You can do the headers and the data. And then we'll go to the Insert tab up top here. And then we're going to click on this little button under Charts. Notice it says Insert Scatter, X, Y, or Bubble Chart. So we're interested in that. And we want just a basic scatter plot, just like that. And notice it gives us a nice scatter plot. So it even did a nice job of putting some numbers on the axes, on the independent axis, the x-axis, or the y-axis, which is the dependent variable. Now, in my case, you'll notice that these gave it like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. The reason is because it's not really that easy to represent these years on this because it's not scalable in that respect. So what it's saying is like year 0, for example, is nothing, but year 1, which would be 2008 to 2009, is at like 4,146. So I'm actually okay with this because it makes it a lot easier to read and understand. And then we can use that to say, okay, we know that this chart starts in 2008 and goes through 2018. So that's all we need to know. So let's go ahead and add a couple of things to this before we move it where we want to go. So we're going to format this. I'm going to click on the plus sign here to add some chart elements. So we can add some axis titles. Let's do that. That looks good. We're actually going to rename these now. You can click on these and you can and type in what they are. So for example, our average attendance per game chart is going to have years for the x-axis, that independent variable. So I type in years. And then for the axis title here, it's going up and down. Let me go to the very top. I will delete all this and then move to average attendance per game. Awesome. Okay, that looks good. And now it's kind of up to you how you want to do this. Now you can set style and colors and things like that. And you can actually include a couple of other things if you like to. You can also do, like, for example, the legend might be nice to put on there too, so you know that this is okay. That's the average attendance per game. That's great. But we kind of already have that over here, so maybe that's not necessary. It's up to you to decide. Now the last thing I want to do is make sure that this gets somewhere where we can read it more easily. Having it just here, just floating around, doesn't do us a whole lot of good. Let's put it in a spot that's easier to get to and easier to read. So what I can do is I can right-click right on top of this chart, this scatter plot, and I can go to this Move Chart option inside of that menu, right in the middle. If I click on Move Chart, I can say, let's put on a new sheet. And I'm actually going to name this sheet Scatterplot. Okay? And what it does now is it makes a brand new tab down here on the bottom called Scatterplot, and notice that this is a much nicer, much bigger Scatterplot to read, and I can see all of my data pretty easily here. I'd also recommend changing this. Notice I already did it. It should say Sheet 1 for you. I would double click on that and rename that to Descriptive Statistics. That way you know which is which. This is the statistics, this is the Scatterplot. Feel free to change any of the styles if you like. You can do any one of these. This one doesn't look too bad. Neither does that one. Maybe I'll do this one. So that way it's a darker theme so we can read it a little bit better. And now we can use this for the next part of our project where we're going to be using this information to interpret what it means in regards to what the data is showing about our specific situation. And then we can justify what we think is going on and then maybe even make some predictions about what will happen outside of the data that we've collected. All right, so that's kind of all you need to do in terms of your statistics and getting that scatter plot set up. So just to review, we calculated all the statistics here with the values. If you go into the function view, we did all of these functions just a little bit ago. We formatted all this data to look a little bit nicer so that way it's more readable. We also made a scatter plot, this one right here. We used the insert tab to do that, insert. Then we went to the charts and did the scatter plot, and then we moved this over to a brand new tab and we gave it a couple of little style changes and added a couple of things. All right, that's all I have for you right now. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Bye.